Some of you have varying degrees of familiarity with the Raft, but it's, of course, it's an acronym for the Resilience Adaptation Feasibility Tool. And the very first thing that we want to point out to you is our goal, which is to help Virginia's coastal localities improve their resilience to flooding and other coastal storm hazards while remaining economically and socially viable. And that's really important because it shows you the balance that we bring to this. We bring all kinds of different expertise from different groups to try to help to improve the resilience and recognizing that you have to remain economically and socially viable as well. The Raft Team is a multi-university effort. We're very excited about that. We've been partnering since 2016. It's Old Dominion University, the Virginia Sea Grant Climate Adaptation and Resilience Program, and William & Mary Law School, the Virginia Coastal Policy Center, which is what I direct, and the University of Virginia Institute for Engagement and Negotiation, which is what Tanya directs. And we have worked well together for many years now. Thank you. Next slide. That's perfect. The Raft is a 3-step process. The first step is a scorecard that we developed with the assistance of an advisory committee composed of academics, local government representatives, state government agencies, and environmental nonprofits. And we do an assessment of a locality's resilience as reflected in their ordinances and policies and programs. And thank you to you all that helped us from the localities in doing the scoring. And an important thing to note is we did do a review of other scorecard type programs, report card type programs, and we came to the conclusion that many of them end up on the shelf and aren't used again. And so we added 2 other stages. One is this workshop. After we work with the localities' staffs to score the programs and to make sure that we're accurate, we present to the governing body, the elected officials, so they know the results. And then we hold a workshop where we invite the localities to come, and we invite citizens and community group representatives, and we invite helpful state agencies. For example, when we did this right before the Middle Peninsula, we did this in the Northern Neck, and the health department was quite helpful on some issues around septic concerns with flooding. And we had the Department of Forestry heavily involved. So many helpful partners. And the goal today is to develop these resilience action checklists of 3 to 5 items to work on to become more resilient over the coming year. And then we go into the final 1-year implementation stage, where we work with you. We host and facilitate monthly meetings of the implementation teams from each locality and try to get through that checklist of items as much as we can and connect you with resources like the state agencies and helpful grant opportunities, etc. Next slide, please. Okay, so the scorecard itself is composed of 5 different components. We look at policy, leadership, and collaboration, risk assessment and emergency management, infrastructure resilience, planning for resilience, planning is so key, and community engagement, health, and well-being. And in particular, that 5th factor we have found is really helpful for communities to discuss, because resilience goes so much beyond the immediate emergency response, which is key as well. But looking at the residents and their health and social equity concerns and wellness, that's really important. Next slide, please. So everyone wants to know how they did in comparison to their neighbors. So this is the total Raft score comparison. And it's not, as you could tell, it's never an A through F situation. It's just a score of how well you're doing. And you all are doing really well to start out. And the in-depth comparisons, again, are available in your locality's Google Drive folder. So you could see more in-depth breakdowns of how those scores were achieved. And each of these were presented to the governing bodies. So this is the same thing, but broken down by the scorecard section. It's showing all these Middle Peninsula localities listed. And section 1 on the left is the policy, leadership, and collaboration. 2, risk assessment and emergency management, infrastructure relief, planning for resilience, and then community engagement, health, and well-being. And on that, I want to note that that's usually, we found when we did the Raft in the Northern Neck, when we did the Raft on the Eastern Shore before this, and when we worked with 3 pilot communities, when we first kicked it off, we worked with a city and a county and a town to test the scorecard. That's usually the category that localities score the lowest on, because it's one that it takes a lot of planning to get to that point and work through that. So we're looking forward to working with you to help and improve that score over the coming year. All right, next slide, please. So some key opportunities for improving community resilience. Under the locality leadership policy and collaboration category, you could think about using adaptive management to update your ordinances and plans based on the data, the scientific analyses, and some emerging strategies and lessons learned that we can bring you from the raft or that you know of. Hold resiliency training for your elected officials and your community leaders with experts so that they can learn more about how to become more resilient, and engage your stakeholders who will need emergency response and vulnerable populations in resiliency meetings. Research and consider participation in the community rating system program of the National Flood Insurance Program, because that brings reduced flood insurance rates to your residents. Next slide, please. Risk assessment and emergency management. You could look at working with community groups to identify vulnerable groups who live or work in flood zones and need some additional attention. Update your resident emergency plan to identify risks and needs. Task the staff with engaging community leaders and community organizations about emergency preparedness, and provide programs for small business emergency preparation. That's often one that people like to talk about, is how do we reach our small businesses in our community and help them to be more prepared? And also business continuity, things they can do to continue after an emergency event. Next slide, please. Infrastructure resilience, increasing the water supply or the stormwater infrastructure resilience. We are more and more finding that our stormwater that was built for yesterday's precipitation events and storm events are not as capable of handling these newer, more severe storm events. So looking at that and a plan to try to address that. Enhancing communication and coordination for water and wastewater stormwater resilience, both. Providing incentives for private property activities that manage stormwater, such as tax deductions or flag program, and working with VDOT to identify and evaluate vulnerable transportation infrastructure. Next slide, please. Oh, and I will note that that's one thing that we did on the Eastern Shore. We brought in VDOT to have a meeting with the town representatives so that they could come to them and find out who to call when they have issues with flooding roads and what kind of funding sources are available. And then planning for resilience, ensuring the comprehensive plan includes potential impacts on critical infrastructure and services, especially regarding vulnerable populations. The comprehensive plan is a wonderful tool. It has a lot of public input opportunities. It's a great thing to look at to increase resilience. Modifying flood zone designations to include areas outside of the FEMA special flood hazard area designations that are still known to flood regularly. We're seeing that more and more. Establishing setbacks to increase safety, and holding community meetings with members of the public to tell them about natural resources preservation and educate them about plans that are available. Next slide, please. Community engagement, health, and well-being is always a key one. Engaging the public in resilience planning, developing resident leaders and volunteers, and acknowledging their work is important to encourage everyone to be involved and have their voices heard in advancing resilience. Creating a coastal resilience committee and assigning staff roles. That's one that's often very popular in the Raft program because it creates a mechanism to continue to have the communication and to continue to have the resilience discussions and planning. And partnering with nonprofits and community groups to identify needs and communicate with vulnerable populations.